If you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to the book of Galatians, chapter 4. And I want to read for the setting of our lesson, verses 1 through 7. Galatians 4, 1 through 7. Paul says this, "What I am saying is that as long as an heir is under age, he is no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, 'Abba, Father,' so that you are no longer a slave, but you're God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir." When the time had fully come. When the time had fully come. This is the time of year when we're very conscious about time. All the way from figuring out how much time do I get off of work for the holiday seasons, to how much time is left till the day of Christmas. Constantly you see reminders of how many days are left till Christmas. Questions related to how much time is it going to take to go somewhere to visit friends or family. Time. It seems to be very much a part of this time of the season, doesn't it? Time itself. The movement of time in our lives is evident. All the way from celebrating our birthdays, in some cases anniversaries, and in other cases, children who are born into the family. There's an irony about time. It seems to go so slow. But when you look back, and we find ourselves saying this in conversation, don't we? It went just like that. It just seems so weird. It seems to go so slow, but it speeds by. Redemption, God's story, Jesus coming into the world, came about at just the right time. If you're an individual who follows the Christian calendar, today is known as the third day of Advent, the third Sunday of Advent. The Advent season is all about recognizing the coming of Jesus. There's, if you like the Christian writer Timothy Keller, he has a little book called The Hidden Christmas. And I like it because he talks about all of the little details in the Christmas story that we don't often think about, but they're very important as you read the gospel stories about Jesus coming into the world. And he made a comment that this week made me radically change some of my theology. And I want to share that with you. I have always said that the greatest miracle on earth is the resurrection of Jesus. Well, I've modified that a little bit because of his work. Not only is it the resurrection of Jesus, but think about, and Rodney said this when he was up here with the communion, Jesus coming in the flesh. The incarnation, God in the flesh, seems to me just as equal and big of a miracle as the resurrection itself. Because without the resurrection, the incarnation doesn't mean anything, but without the resurrection, neither does the incarnation. We need both of those. The miracle of God coming in the flesh, the miracle of God raising Jesus from the dead. We need both of those. You see, this Christian worldview of time has several advantages. You don't have to get swallowed up in the fatalism of our time when you're a Christian with the worldview of time. You don't have to have the idea that there's no purpose here on earth anymore. There's no cyclical view of existence that never ends. I just come back in a better form. You can't say that life itself is meaningless. Because this worldview of time, God at work, and in just the right time, He sent His Son. It affirms the psalmist's view of the world. A beautiful phrase in Psalm 31:15. Our times are in His hands. Think about it. And we say that, don't we? In God's timing, not my timing. Think of all the times in conversation you've had to say that to someone. It's not in my timing, but it's in God's timing. This past week, I went to the store to talk to someone about doing a job at home that I know I shouldn't tackle. One of my favorite shows years ago was Home Improvement. Tim Allen was me. Any job there were some jobs that I would attempt, it was much better to get someone else to professionally do it. Otherwise, in the end, I'm paying double anyway. So I went to the store this past week and sat down and began discussing with the individual there what needed to be done. Because I'd already gone to the same store a week earlier. And the more this individual got into it, the more discombobulated my brain got, the bigger the job got, the more complex it got. And I'm sitting there looking at him like deer in the headlights. And I said, let's back the truck up a little bit. You tell me that you've worked in this area, you know how to do these kind of repairs. If you were doing this, knowing that this is what you do for a living, how would you go about doing this? He said, I'm glad you asked, because I have insider information. Here's how I would do it. So he lays out something so simple. I said, let's do it that way. And so we're talking quite a while. And then he says, since you've been so kind, I'm going to put a pause button right there. And I'm not going to tell you the rest of what he said till the end of my lesson. And I'm going to tell you why he said this. Since you've been so kind, I'm going to, so hang on there. In this passage, in Galatians chapter 4, there's some things about the timing being just right that is amazing. And I wish we had time to delve into all of it, but I at least want to share a little bit of it so that you can understand how crucial this statement is in Galatians 4, 4 and 5. I didn't really understand how crucial it was several years ago when we were working with a church up in Lansing, Michigan. And I wish I could remember what it was called. It was a Christian group on campus at Michigan State University. They had invited Dr. Gary Meyer, who was a history professor at Western Michigan University. He had published a book, and you can still find it. It's called In the Fullness of Time. And in that particular book, he talks about several dimensions of the gospel story of Jesus' birth that he rooted in historical event, because he's a historian. And one thing, this is kind of a sidebar, I was amazed. Two things. In the student center, that place was packed. Must have been, this is a preacher's guess. 1,000 students on campus came to this event. Two things amazed me. Number one, the questions that were asked, very penetrating questions that he had to grapple with as a historian, and he did really well. Number two was how many young people at that age didn't know some of the basics of the Christian story that you and I take for granted. But it's really fascinating. But in his book, On the Fullness of Time, it was that presentation that first helped me to see in a fascinating way. God has always been at work. His plan has always been unfolding. And one of the things he said at the end of the presentation was just fascinating. The fullness of God, and there's a passage here, a phrase in Galatians 4, when we get toward the end of the lesson, you're going to see it. This fullness of God's work and His timing culminates in my own life. How has God's timing affected me? How has God's timing changed my own view of time and changed my own way of living in view of that time? So what about Galatians 4 and the fullness of God's timing? We see it prophetically. I was thinking about this, and you know this if you know the story at all. The first temptation in Genesis chapter 3. After God comes to Adam and God comes to Eve and said, okay, you guys, you've blown it. Here's the consequences. Then he talks to Satan. And this is in Genesis 3:14. So the Lord God said to the serpent, because you've done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all the wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. So that's an original curse on Satan. But listen to the next verse, verse 15. I will put enmity or hatred between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush, that's the offspring will crush your head and you will strike his heel. In the history of Christian interpretation, that's always been explained and understood to mean that when Satan would strike the heel of the offspring, that's Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And that Jesus' resurrection is the crushing of Satan's head. Now, that may be exactly what's in that verse. I'm not sure, but I like that interpretation. Because it makes us aware that no matter what Satan is up to, he doesn't have the final say. God's timing. There's a commercial on TV, and it comes in two different forms. It shows an ear of corn on a stalk, just about ready to be picked. On another occasion, it shows a branch with a whole bunch of green beans hanging down. And it'll show a hand, and it says, wait, 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 and then they snatch it and it's ready. The ear of corn, just the right time, it's ready to eat. The green beans, just at the right time, they're ready to pick and to eat and to cook. And so if you've ever grown those sort of things, you know how significant time is. This prophetic emphasis, Daniel 9:24 through 27. There's a lengthy passage here about the prophecy that God gives to Daniel. And it is not only a prophecy on how Jerusalem's going to be rebuilt, but he talks about the abomination of desolation and how it looks like that the temple itself is going to be ruined. And yet, as he lays out the time, there's all these 70 weeks and 7, and if you read different commentators, historically they've come up with all kinds of ways to figure out exactly when that is. And it reminds me of some of the calculations in Revelation, and I have the same response to that. Since we don't know exactly what he's talking about, and that your and my interpretation might be different on the exact event that he's referring to, I am confident of one thing though. It makes us aware that God's timing is very carefully planned. Doesn't matter the exact date, doesn't matter the exact event, because the prophet doesn't tell us. We can sort of guess. But the important thing is we get the impression right away that this thing called the Jesus story, this reality of the incarnation, it wasn't by accident. God planned it historically and prophetically. Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 10. A shoot will grow out of Jesse's root stock. A bud will spring forth from its roots. At that time, a root from Jesse will stand like a signal flag for the nations. Nations will look to him for guidance, and his residence will be majestic. You see, there was great anticipation on the part of the Jews that the Messiah would come. And the Roman rule over Israel and the attending territories just made them hunger that much more for the Messiah. Now, they didn't know exactly what he was going to look like, and they had their own minds kind of made up when Jesus came. But in God's fullness of time, prophetically, All of the prophets pointed to this event. Historically, it's interesting. You see, Rome had unified much of the world of that day under its government, and it gave a sense of unity to all the different lands it had conquered. And because of that, the empire was relatively peaceful. And this map, I want to point something out. I know you can't read all the little towns, but if you can make out the little red lines, that's all you need to see. If you can see the little red lines all over the Roman Empire, this is approximately 80,500 kilometers of paved road in the ancient Roman Empire. That's a lot of paved road. And when Rome had reached the height of its power, there were 29 great military highways that they would use. Now, the Romans didn't, of course, invent some of these roads, but it was such that travel during the time of Jesus and during the time that the gospel was presented after his resurrection and the church began and it spread out into the Greco-Roman Empire, there are individuals who would say that historically the time was right just for the practical nature of spreading the gospel because of all of the Roman roads. And that's a study in itself if we had time. There are many, many famous roads. The Ignatian Way that Paul obviously traveled whenever he went between many of the churches that he established. But then also, in the fullness of time culturally, as we mentioned, Rome had unified much of its government throughout all the lands, and there was what was called the Peace of Rome, the Pax Romana, that it saw itself in a golden age where that travel was much easier. Christians, because of that, could spread the gospel, and there was the freedom to travel where before they could not. Rome had conquered militarily, but Greece had conquered culturally. And one thing that's interesting, all over the Roman Empire, there is, and we sort of see this from many of the writings, the idols and the worship of the gods and goddesses had failed to give many Roman and Greek citizens a sense of purpose and given them a sense of direction. They felt like their religion was empty. The mystery religions of the time emphasized a Savior God that would require worshipers to offer bloody sacrifices. So the Greeks, in many instances, didn't have a hard time to think about. It wasn't hard for them to think about an ultimate sacrifice with blood. So the time, historically, prophetically, culturally, was right. When the time was right. Redemptively. In Galatians 4, he says we're heirs. But first of all, we're under the guardians and stewards until the appointed time. We're under the rudimentary principles until the fullness of time, which I take that to mean it's parallel to the law as expressed in the practice of circumcision, the dietary rules, the calendar observances of the festivals, and the ceremonial purity. And it was the recognition that the covenant with the Jewish nation found its fulfillment in the right time, the fullness of time, when Jesus set foot on the earth. The Christmas story is simple here in Galatians 4. God sent his Son. Look at the language once again. God sent his Son. Born of a woman. There is the incarnation. Born of a woman, born under the law to redeem those under the law. God sent his Son to redeem us. That's the occasion of joy. This biblical reason I've noticed in several Christmas movies that I've watched, they don't really go back to this part of the story. Joy is more about being together as family, and joy is because you got a great gift, and all these occasions for joy, but nobody goes back to the Galatians 4 part of the story. So it leads us to the question then, is the time right for him to come personally? Prophetically, culturally, historically, redemptively. Yes, Fullness of time and all of those dimensions. But now the question is it the right time for him to come personally? Go back to Galatians 1 or 4, verses 1 through 7. Do you know twice in that paragraph it says God sent? God sent his Son. Then, because you're his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. An additional dimension of incarnation. It's now Jesus in our flesh. So the Christmas story is not just a story about God sending his Son into the world. It continues as a story in which God sends his Son into my heart. Ooh. Let's continue with my story at the beginning. Since you have been so kind, and you have to know this part of the story, I had been to this store a week before and got this work order all done. Well, they did it wrong. And to make matters worse, they charged me $35 to do it. And the manager says, since you've been so kind, I'm going to refund you your $35. He said, that's a Christmas gift. I said, well, thank you. I said, what? I said, I've just been trying to work through this. He said, so you're telling me that people who have come in have not been so kind? He goes, you have no idea. I said, now wait a minute. This is the Christmas season. He said, that makes no difference. And what it made me think of was this part of what Paul is saying. God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts. We say we believe in the Christmas story. Is it in here? Can people see it when we relate to them every day on the work site, at the job, interacting with people at the store? Is the Christmas story in here? That's where it makes a difference. Maybe this morning you need to experience God sending the Spirit of his Son into your heart. Just what Paul says. If you need to come this morning and let that happen, so that the Christmas story is God's story in you, won't you come while we stand and sing?